My name is Heather Strang, and I have the pleasure of chairing this discussion, this session, which is on the topic of, I think you'll agree when you've heard all about it, a really important innovation in policing generally, in relation to police response, and particularly in relation to domestic abuse victims. It's my great pleasure to introduce two members here of the Kent Police Innovation Task Force, Stacey Rothwell and Kent McFadzean. We're going to split the presentation. Stacey is going to open saying a few words about the background, first of all, to this idea, this rapid video response for domestic abuse victims. And she'll begin by tracing a little bit of recent history around how this program developed, and with particular reference to what a program known as RTREC, which is rapid telecommunications for victims. And so I'll leave that to Stacey to tell you about, and then to introduce the idea of the rapid video response, and then Kent will take us through some of the findings from the randomized control trial that we did.
Some of you may have heard some of my talks that I've given previously, but Kent and I have updated the slides to give you some new analysis and insights that you wouldn't have seen before, and also to talk to implementation of virtual response within Kent Police. So we'll start at the beginning, and that's what is the problem, one that many forces seem to be suffering with, both nationally and internationally. And that essentially drew me to do some research and look into what is the number of calls that we're servicing and how is our response to that. And what I managed to find out was that during 2018, forces in England and Wales had serviced 26 million telephone calls for service. It's interesting to know that HMIC of the same year did a report where they looked into how we were able to respond to that, and they said for immediate response we were doing pretty well, but beyond that, those calls that required a physical response that wasn't immediate, it becomes very difficult for police officers and forces to service those. To give you some context, and it was really useful to have the brilliant team from the MPCC and VORG do the last presentation with the emphasis around domestic abuse. It was also interesting to note that we had 5.5% of adults suffering with domestic abuse during 2020, and during a 24-hour period we received over 3,000 calls in our control rooms across England and Wales that are domestic abuse related. So that tells you the scale of the problem, and then how we're going to do things differently. I did some analysis for my thesis, which essentially looked at the calls during 2019 in Kent, and that's a medium-sized county force in the southeast of England. And what I managed to find out was that we had over 800,000 telephone calls for service. There are other methods of reporting to us, so that's also useful to know, but from which we'd created 270,000 incidents and determined that 175,000 required attendance by an officer. So to put a figure in your mind, that's essentially 500 calls every day that require physical attendance, and we all know that we usually send more than one officer. So what was the beginning of the journey? What you can see there is the research questions. So, can police increase victim satisfaction, reduce cost and improve effectiveness by diverting what would have been an intended non-urgent visit to an immediate telephone service by a warranted police officer? So RTREC at the top there stands for Rapid Telecommunication Response to Emergency Calls. I'll talk today about that, and RVR. So those two acronyms will be useful to know. But essentially this was a trial, proof of concept, a randomised control trial that we did 2 years ago, essentially for non-domestic abuse calls for service. I'll go through the types of calls that we service in a moment, but this was the first of the two randomised control trials that I'm going to tell you about today. Essentially, in England, we have calls that we have to go to straight away, which we call immediate calls, and we'll go to save life and limb, and we'll usually go in a fast police car with the blue lights flashing. Beneath that, we have what we call priority calls, which are those that we must get to soon and we need to send an officer to. And then beneath that, we have what are called scheduled or appointed calls, where we know that we must go to them, but there is not necessarily a time reason for us to be trying to service it rapidly, and we'll schedule those for an appointment. So we've got immediates, then we have priorities, and then we have appointed calls. What we're going to look at today are anything beneath immediate. So we're looking at those group of calls that sit in between. And this first trial only looks at priority calls. So we excluded appointed calls as well. So it's worth knowing they were the ones that we intended to get to as rapidly as we could, but not in an immediate situation. So what types of calls did we look at? You can see there, that's the priority call, which was just explained. It's really, really important to note that they're live and incoming calls. This isn't a resolution service, it is a response service. So we are there to do frontline response. The College of Policing quite helpfully defines what a first response is, and you can look that up, but essentially to go to the scene, to protect the victim, to collect evidence. That was the response service we were looking to test as a different response service. So for the first trial, it was non-domestic abuse calls, and it had to be a relevant call type. And we had a selection of call types that were included within the trial, and there's details of that within the thesis. And again, the second important part to the live is that it must be optional for victims. So this was a service that we were given to victims, which is unusual in policing, to be able to say, what response service would you actually like? It's important to know that in order to get statistical significance, we had to get a number of calls through in the randomised control trial, and we got 450. The trial started before COVID, so the timeliness of it actually now is fairly fortunate, but at the time, this telephone response was the concept. And when you're thinking about the types of calls that we dealt with, I'll tell you that 57% of those were threats calls. So what did we find when we tested this, and we tested our physical response policy against an immediate telephone response by an officer? Well, this is what we found. So we had a statistically significant finding where we could improve victim satisfaction from, there you see it's 69 to 93%, which was really, really helpful in being able to show the difference for our victims. We also, we did this by doing victim satisfaction interviews. We got a 72.5% response rate on that interview, which was really good. And we asked them a variety of questions. This is just one of them, including the levels of trust and confidence and what service they expected, and all those details are within the thesis. But this is the first RCT, so I'm just covering it fairly briefly. Moving then to what else we tracked. So we also looked at the efficiency of our officers, and we tracked our officers using the geolocation on their radios and in their vehicles to work out what the response delay was for victims. And this is really, really important, and the ladies from Vorg explained that we should be looking to see what the victim journey looks like and sit through the victim lens. And essentially what we found was that our response delay was 2 days and 10 hours for the physical response and 0 for our telephone response, and that there was a time saving there in officer time that you can see displayed there between our traditional intended physical response and our RVR. There's some cost savings there, just modelled on what we thought could be an annual estimation of calls, with the saving converted, and they were on 2020 rates of £12.58 per call, and potential savings, although our Chief Constable was much more interested in the improvement in the victim journey as opposed to the efficiencies. So moving on then really to then what that led to, we were lucky enough to secure some funding from the Home Office Science, Technology Analysis and Research Fund, who have really supported us in being able to then replicate the randomised control trial. We were gluttons for punishment and wanted to do a second one. But essentially this was so that we could help to create this evidence base in changing the way in which we do a frontline response. You can see there that we use good sound video software. Obviously there are other video software providers, but we used them because it meant that we were able to instantly connect with victims, and what we wanted to do was to be able to use a video service and test it against that traditional delayed physical attendance. And for this trial, we went for the priority calls and the appointed calls. So domestic abuse, priority and appointed. We wanted to test three things this time, so not only to look at the caller satisfaction with the victim satisfaction interviews, but also the cost effectiveness, again by tracking officers using their geolocation, and the investigative outcomes. We did it again using the same methodology of a randomised control trial, and essentially our call eligibility was, as you can see on the screen there, so it had to be a domestic abuse where the offender was not present and the offending wasn't continuing. The priority or appointment call grade, again, it must be a live call with the victim still on the line. We do a risk assessment to make sure that the victims are safe and are able to use the technology, and very importantly, they have to opt into the response service. So what is the concept? It's an immediate virtual frontline first response service to replicate what we do with a digital operating model. We want to be able to use the video software to enable us to immediately engage with victims, to protect them and to apprehend offenders quickly, and also to capture that evidence faster because the calls are recorded.
He can get a little bit unpredictable in that sometimes on the weekends he might drink a lot or sort of binge drink, and he did have a cocaine habit, so at the weekends he would take drugs, and then that necessarily would change his mood. Like at the time that he had taken the drugs, or then the next day he would be moody and depressed. So he just was never sort of on a level, and I can see that now in his behaviour now because come the evening time or especially at the weekend, his messages are far more angry.
Right, so it follows that same pattern through the communication as well. Okay. Has he been contacting anybody else, like any family or friends of yours?
He hasn't been doing that, but I know that he's been sort of looking at what I've been doing through my social media and working out where I am, because I haven't told him where I'm going, obviously, and then he'll say, oh, I know you're at the park or whatever, so I know he knows of my whereabouts, and the only way he could have found that out would have been through my social media.
Okay. Has he physically kind of turned up where you are at all, or turned up unannounced at your house or anything like that, other than dropping off presents?
No, he hasn't arrived physically that I've caught him. So I think he's doing the presents and stuff when he knows I'm not going to be there, and that's when he sent the flowers to my work. It's more, I suppose, that I'm constantly getting reminded that he is there, and it's not nice coming home to balloons on my doorstep and things when they're unwanted, and I really want him to move on and leave me alone, but it's getting worse. So it's getting more
absolutely. And I think it must be quite difficult thinking of your home as a safe space to then come home and he's been there. That must be really hard.
Yeah, it is, and I suppose because I know he's unpredictable, I'm just worried about what he might do next. And he's obviously taking it bad, and I want him to move on and live his own life, and I want to live my own life. So it does make it really quite hard and stressful, and I come home now apprehensive about what I might find.
And that gives you the idea of the concept to be there for victims immediately. So this shows you the process, and this is really actually, I think, the golden nugget for it all, that the call will come into the control room and it will be triaged and assessed in its usual way. Our call takers will take it and they will identify exactly what it is and what risk that it poses. Meanwhile, we have a dispatcher that is able to do a risk assessment and to work with the call takers and with the RVR officers to make sure they're ready and prepared for the call when it comes across. They'll then communicate with the victim, they'll conduct the risk assessments, and then once the victim opts into the service, and we're happy to do it, we'll get the RVR officer to immediately send the text message to the victim's device whilst we keep the call on the line to confirm that they've received it. We then terminate the call in the control room, and they're straight away on the recorded line to the officer. What our operational model allows for in its design is for examples where the technology might fail, or we don't have enough RVR officers available, or if the risk should escalate and perpetrators should turn up, we're able, because we've based it within our brilliant control room, we're able to immediately dispatch patrols to it and protect victims from risk who otherwise would have been awaiting attendance in a different way. So now I'm going to pass you across to Kent McFadzean, who's going to explain to you the trial design and the results.
We've heard a lot about block designs over this conference. We also did a block design based on whether the domestic abuse incident was a intimate relationship or a familial relationship, so non-intimate, and split between males and females. The reasons for this, where there's obviously a lot of literature, criminological interest in the female victims of domestic abuse, specifically as a cohort, and also the interest, obviously, last presentation about violence against women and girls in general. We also were aware that these four groups may look quite different. They might have quite different risk profiles, and we wanted to reduce our variability within our samples, the homogeneous effect, so we could assess in a more accurate statistical way the impact of our randomised trial. As you can tell, the largest proportion, as would be expected, was our female intimate cohort at 69%, where we had 357. In the entire trial, we had 517 participants. The analysis, which I'll discuss today, we looked at all cases, so the 517, and then we also looked at the female intimate independently. We don't have the sample to look at the other three groups at this point. So just a little bit about the trial. The trial ran from the 23rd of February 2021 to the 28th of May. We had 73 shifts across the week. The vast majority of the shifts were late turn, 2 till 10, as you can see there. They finished at 10 in terms of shift pattern. We didn't accept any calls after 9 p.m. And you can see in our rather strict eligibility criteria, which we'll discuss, which Stacey discussed briefly, and I'll cover a bit further, we were getting about 1 call an hour into the system. And that didn't really change over the week. In terms of times, there were peaks in the mid-afternoon, around 3 p.m, which we, just from chatting to the victims while we were triaging them, a lot of them were on school runs and things like that, so that they became eligible because there was no, the offender wasn't present, and it was because they were carrying out activities in their normal day, which they would be expected to not be in the presence of the offender, and allowing us, therefore, to take these type of jobs. So there's a peak about 3 p.m, and I think once it's now been rolled out, and we were doing mornings, I think Stacey will look at implementation. I think there's also a morning peak as well. This is a complicated one, so I don't want to spend too much time on this, but this is just what people actually got. So don't pay too much attention to the kind of detail in here. Essentially, we randomised our 517 cases. Our control group was business as usual, so we didn't try too hard to force it to get an in-person response. We just want to see what Kent Police do in standard offerings. So you can see out of the 253 there on the left, about 2/3 of them received an in-person response across the areas that Stacey mentioned. So in-station appointments, which was that third category, or the priority high, which was the lists for attendance. What's interesting here is our rapid video response is how high our success was. We had 91% of our victims, 242 of them, received the intended treatment. All our analysis in this, we do intention to treat, so the fact that 33% didn't get an in-person on the business as usual side, and 6% had failure on the rapid video response, we still analysed that as what they were intended to receive. There were, interestingly, a few cases on each side. You'll see there 6 on each where we turn them into immediates. So circumstances changed. Usually it was the return of the offending party, and we would then dispatch a police car to attend that in person. So they had the joint one. The failures on the RVR side are generally technology related. When you using cell phone 4G connectivity is generally all right, but Kent has some rural areas, and so there's some issues around that. And we had one failure of appointment that was, with one of the things with randomised trials, you have to expect the unexpected. So our victim, having gone into the trial, and we said we're going to transfer you to one of the PCs, she goes, "Oh, I know that PC." So we're not able to send her to speak to someone she knew. In terms of the results, I'll cover the victim interview, the protocol, results and implications. We're mainly focusing for this presentation on the victim lens, and then I'll do a very short coverage of outcomes. It's been a year, so I ran it a couple of days ago, so I can just do a quick update on that. The interview protocol was quite interesting for us to develop. We sought to obtain their consent at the time of engagement at randomisation. So when we spoke to them before the text message was sent in the treatment group, and before we said that they'd be receiving a service in the control group, we asked them that would they mind being contacted, and sort of primed them to say, would they mind being contacted in the next 10 days, or after 10 days, in order to speak to a surveyor to get an interview. And of all the people, the vast majority said yes. We gave a 10-day wait period because we didn't want to contaminate. We wanted to give a time for the service to be delivered. This is a trade-off. The longer you leave it, the more their memory might be affected. The shorter you have it, there might be victims who haven't actually received a service at that point. So we chose 10 days. We had a high level of contact, so 13. So we made many attempts. We stopped attempting once they spoke to us, whenever that was, unless they said, "Oh, I'm busy now, but if you call me back soon, I can deal with it." And so that's that next point about we didn't pester them as such. Once they didn't want to be involved, we said no. We also did extensive training of our interviewers, and had weekly meetings to get feedback on how each of their cases were going, and so that they could learn as a group and improve on getting buy-in from our victims. And overall, which we're very happy about, we had over 80% of our victims took the time to speak to us about their response. So this is just summarised in a table. So there were 6 people who said that they wouldn't want to be contacted. The vast majority did. And then when we tried to recontact them, 95, we were unsuccessful for those various reasons. Participation declined, or we couldn't recontact them. So the analysis I'm going to go through today is based on this 80.5%, 416, and that's overall, and then there's 80% for the victim female intimate group, the 69% sample, of which we got again 80% response rate for those. These are the quick topics I'll cover. So why they called, this will just be descriptive statistics for the most part, and then a few statistical tests. So why they called, the level of seriousness, anxiety, satisfaction, if there was any problems from their perspective caused by the delay, whether they would use RVR again, short coverage of trust and confidence before I cover the outcome measures. So just quickly on our victim characteristics. So victims were aged everywhere from 18 to, I think it was about 78, I think was our oldest participant. Obviously, the population, if you compare this with population, it would appear that there's a lower level in the elderly group, but the reporting of domestic abuse is not proportionate to the population. So our messaging here really is that while there's some people discuss whether you can use video for people who aren't quite so up to speed with technology, I think that might have changed somewhat with COVID and speaking to grandchildren and things, but we could do it. We did do it successfully with elderly participants. And interestingly, a very large proportion of them were admit for disability. So I've just got a thing I want to read here to you. So yeah, a large minority of interviewed participants said they had a disability. 408 of those who responded, 131, so that's 32%, said yes. And the largest self-declared disabilities were things like anxiety, depression, mental health, PTSD, and then there was other sort of self-declared disabilities, so bipolar, autism, Asperger's, some learning difficulties, some limited mobility. And so, when we spoke to the victims, they, the ones with physically disabled, they reported back to us that they liked the fact that they didn't have to travel. That was one of the positive impacts of being able to do this over video. So we asked them, why did you call? The vast majority wanted to report the incident or get assistance. 12% was their primary reason for calling was to get prosecution, which seems to fit studies like CARA and things like that. So the main aim for people calling in this cohort was not a judicial outcome. We asked them how serious they thought their incident was. This is an interesting one. I don't want to take too long on it, but there's a bit of an aside about how you triangulate, how police consider seriousness, how the victim considers seriousness. So obviously, as Stacey said, we only are choosing the categories below the immediate response. So from a policing perspective, these are our mid-level domestic abuse calls for service, but almost 60% of our victims said that they considered their incident to be serious or very serious, and about a quarter said they were not very serious or mild. Interestingly, obviously, these calls waiting up to 33 hours in the control groups. There's a lot of time that goes by in these cases to get service. When we did get around to doing DARA, the DARA assessments found that there was actually a reasonable amount of risk in there. 6% high DARA, 37% medium DARA. So there's, as I say, it'd be interesting for police officers to think about that. When you've got domestic abuse victims who've reported their incident to police, who, when you finally get round to seeing them in a couple of days' time, you're grading the DARA risk at high and medium. Is it appropriate that they've been waiting for service that long, and how that fits in with Thrive and things like that? So, just one to think about. We also asked them how anxious they were at the time. Very anxious, which is not a surprise. The follow-up on that was, we had a much substantial reduction in their anxiety 10 days later when we surveyed them, which was statistically significant. We were interested in the difference in the delay, whether it caused them any problems. We didn't inquire necessarily what the problems were, but just if there was one, and about 12% of people said that they did have it with the business as usual. There was one case in the rapid video response that the time caused a problem, which is interesting, but I think they might not have, we're not quite sure what the reason for that is, because the average time's about a minute, isn't it? 2 minutes. So this is the key headline: statistical significant finding in the increased satisfaction for our female intimate partner victims who received rapid video response. There was no difference in satisfaction in the analysis of all 4 groups. Kent Police have a very high level of base satisfaction anyway, so we're talking 79% satisfied in the business as usual. So that's obviously very commendable, but also quite hard statistically to find a difference. So we're very happy to see that. When we asked the victims who had rapid video response if they would have it again, so this is just our treatment group, 80% of them, or slightly under, said that they would prefer in the future to do the video again, and the other 20% said they would choose the delayed in person, or having not had the delayed in person, so they may not know that journey. And that's reassuring. Also, obviously, one of the key messages for rapid video response is the optionality, and we think that how that would play out through time if people had both, that they'd be able to have an understanding of which option they preferred. Trust and confidence. Obviously, Professor Weisberg talked yesterday about the complexity and unpacking exactly what this may mean. This is victim perception. Our Chief Constable is very interested in this, is what they think. So it's what their own interpretation of what trust and confidence means. I've stripped out here the about 47% of people who said that their trust and confidence didn't change. So this is just the ones that changed. And the numbers, so for the female intimate partner, which that's overall, the female intimate partner, you had 44, in numbers terms, 44 said their trust and confidence, their confidence had gone up versus 20 they'd gone down. In the RVR group it was 73 up and 9 down. So you're looking at least 3 times more overall, and which is the graphs on the screen there, and about 5 times more increase in confidence and trust, and that is statistically significant. So we're finding that from their own interpretation of what they take trust and confidence mean, they like that. Couple of feedback points we found when we asked them what they liked about it, what they didn't like about it. Three main themes came out: privacy, convenience, and speed and reassurance. I hadn't really thought about much of this before we did the trial, so it is interesting that, you know, a police car turning up on their doorstep and the ability to the neighbours to know what's happening seems to be quite a benefit for a lot of people. So that's good that we can offer them that service. And there's another quote about speed and reassurance, and people have, you know, sitting around doubting themselves about what was going to happen with their case. For so now I'll just switch quickly to our efficiency and effectiveness measures. This is how fast we responded to the 2 groups. Within 8 hours, we'd responded to everyone in the rapid video response group. After 48 hours, we were almost at 80% for the control group. As you can see, the delay in response times up there. The biggest savings were that all rapid video responses, 1 officer would respond to them. Often when you send a patrol car, you have 2. So the vast majority of your savings for resourcing, from a resourcing perspective, come from that. So the 2.2 hours to 3 hours 25. A lot of that's explained by that the double car officer figures. So, and obviously, while people are waiting, they call back to say, "Where's my police officer?" Very quickly, our outcomes from arrests. The primary, secondary, obviously RVR primary means we're dispatching someone to do what they call relentless pursuit here, which is where we get someone to go see if they can find an offender straight away. Overall, there's a much larger chunk in the secondary investigation phase for rapid video response, but overall, for both phases, there's much more arrests in the rapid video response. This is fresh from last week because it's been finished for a year, so I just went and checked. We still have a few active cases, about 5. We don't know what's happening with the transferred and the cancelled cases. There's a large minority of cases which are non-crime incidents, so they won't get outcomes. But broadly speaking, there's no statistically significant difference in detection rates between our 2 groups. And I guess that's the overall take-home message from me, is that on the variables we looked at, there was a benefit to RVR, or we found that the 2 services were commensurate. So that's a positive take-home message, is that this is an optional service. We're getting lots of efficiency and effectiveness benefits, increased satisfaction, and then not much difference in other measures. Quickly, just to finish my section, just to show you an estimated modelling over a year in Kent Police, and feedback into what sort of crime types we're talking about. The risk categories. Immediates we don't touch in the rapid video response. High, which is the priority calls, we think we'd do about a third of those, and we'd do well over half of the appointment calls. That's the modelling that suggests. So we think that the ability to offer rapid video response could have quite a big impact on frontline policing response. And one of the fantastic things about this trial is Kent Police has taken it on board, and we have it up and running.
So yeah, we're lucky in Kent to be able to implement it. These were the operational benefits that came out of the work that we did. Essentially, to run you quickly through those, essentially to do that expedited service, to do the immediate response and do the immediate referrals thereafter to our partner agencies, to have a victim choice-centred service, faster response for those people that do get the rapid video response, but also for those that are awaiting physical attendance, because our frontline officers have less to attend. We did a proof of concept with an independent violence advisor, so counselling support advice providing immediately after the officer. That worked really well for the victim. Improved timeliness, so we capture and record the evidence in the footage and any possible res geste evidence. No reduction in our outcomes, which Kent's explained. Increased opportunities for relentless pursuit. I'll give you a couple of examples in a moment. And we were able to have some resourcing efficiencies with officers working remotely. Essentially, what I want to now really look at is the implementation. We've been implemented in Kent since the 18th of May. We've got a specially trained, brilliant team. They must get a mention for the work that they've done in the last 2 months. And that's enabled me to be able to share with you how we've then implemented it. So we've done it with in a way that's worked well for us to have, some consideration and planning around implementation with an implementation board where we've considered things like how it's going to fit into the business. Our force control rooms, like a game of dominoes, you change something over here and it affects something over there. So there was some planning that had to go into that, and our IT colleagues worked hard to be able to give officers access. Information security and governance is a strong one where we want to make sure that we're compliant with the rules and that we're protecting our video footage. And we've got some really detailed force policies and standing operating procedures that we've built for both RVR officers, for our coordinators and our call takers to make sure that we're able to complete this service. We've done staff selection, training, engagement and briefings to make sure that officers are selected, engaged, enthusiastic and fully trained and able to focus on our domestic abuse victims. And that's given us a real ability, and I can see it in the control room every day, a consistent and very, very good service for our victims of domestic abuse in Kent. Supervision and quality assurance, we're able to watch the videos back, we've built quality assurance frameworks to check that everything's been done in the way that we would like, and benefit realisation around doing post and pre-analysis to make sure that we're still providing timeliness and a great victim journey. Just data we found, it was interesting, we never ran the trial on a Monday morning. It seems that we have a real peak in demand on a Monday morning, which I suppose when you think about it, historical domestic abuse, that may well be a time when perpetrators aren't present. And that just shows you there's some demand. But we need to model this over a year and make sure that we can see with incoming call demand, anybody that's worked in that environment knows that we have to see how that fluctuates. We run it at the moment from 8 until 8 on weekdays and 10 until 6 on weekends. We've got a team of 21 officers and 6 sergeants and 1 inspector. They're all fantastic, but essentially we've been able to service in that first month 309 rapid video response calls. So what that's done for us operationally, this is really effective stuff. So I've got some case studies up there and some that I can just talk to. We've got a number of cases where we've been able to speak to the victim immediately, task our frontline colleagues to do an arrest. That often occurs within a few hours, and then we get the suspect arrested and remanded overnight, which is a lot sooner than the average 33-hour delay should it have gone across to our physical attendance. There's lots of cases I can't tell you the detail of that are currently in progress, but essentially the victims speak directly to our RVR officers, and I sit there listening to them in the control room, and the victims are very, very grateful for the service they received. One male victim burst into tears the other day and said that he was really, really reassured by the victim service from the officers. This shows you that, so some satisfaction work we've done, PC Sing and PC Read there, you can see the highlighted words. We're doing really well. The victims really, really appreciate the service. I know that because when I've facilitated the calls in the control room, they really, really like the fact that they've been dealt with straight away. Looking at replication and iteration, so we've been working with quite a lot of national and international police forces. There's somebody here from Canada who's replicating it. this really for us is the beginning of a journey, and we want to iterate on what we found and how we could use virtual policing to enhance our services to victims. We've had interest and support from a variety of agencies, including the MPCC, the College of Police and the Home Office, and we're looking to hopefully help other forces be able to replicate what we've done and to make sure that we can do it in a fashion whereby we make sure we protect victims from risk and keep this optional and immediate response to calls for service. And essentially they're looking to iterate it. If you had to think about it, and believe me, I have, there are many ways in which we could expand this. We could be expanding it to different call types. We could be expanding it to different uses. I know that there has been, this week in the press, political interest in doing interviews for suspects. So if you think really broadly about how we could use video software and its capability to enhance the service that we give to victims, to give them the help they need when they call for help.
I just wanted to emphasize a couple of things. In relation to the operationalizing of this intervention, I think it's important to appreciate that the technology that was used was really amazingly easy for the victims to connect to. I think that sometimes people assume that anything like this has got to be complicated, but basically anybody who had a mobile phone was able to connect and did so. We had really no problems at all, I think, not with any cases in relation to the actual physical connection. It's also important from a kind of operational point of view to appreciate that it's possible to use officers on restricted duties for this sort of work very efficiently, and there were officers who had good experience in dealing with domestic abuse cases who were able to work on this experiment, and they were fabulous. It's also important to appreciate that, of course, there's always the backup available for the physical visit. And as Kent mentioned, in 6 cases, when the offender returned, when the victim was anxious about that, then the case became an immediate case, and there was a dispatch right away. I also wanted to just mention that it is important to understand that there were differential results by cohort, and it was pleasing that by far the best result was for women victims of intimate partner abuse, because that's always the biggest category of callers, and so it's important that they be a very satisfied group. We didn't have enough cases really in the other 3 cohorts to be certain whether or not this alternative was a good idea for them. As Kent has already showed, there was a non-significant result for them, but it may just be not enough cases. And I also wanted to emphasize that this was a very, very well-run experiment that had a very high response rate when victims were called, around 80%. So the internal validity of this study is very strong. And really you can take the findings to the bank, at least in relation to the women victims of intimate partner abuse. And I think that has implications in terms of its adoption in other locations. Sometimes people assume they've got to go on reinventing the wheel and that they shouldn't have it at their place unless they've done an RCT, and they know they're never going to do an RCT because it's too complicated and expensive, so they don't necessarily feel confident about actually introducing the innovation. this population where IVR was tested, of course, had a particular character. You could see that it was something like 85% white British. So we have to certainly bear that in mind in terms of generalizing it to other locations. And of course, there's the fact that it was the female IPV victims who benefited most from the innovation. But it isn't essential to do an RCT every time before you introduce a program. And for those places that may feel they have a population that looks similar to those who participated in this program and are willing to test gently, even without an RCT, but just to pilot it, try it, have a look at results as you go along. I think that that's something that we would recommend, that you take that approach rather than worrying about doing an in-depth test in your place.
Yes, my name is Peter Doyle from Brunel University, London. Very interesting talk indeed, and certainly an area of great risk within policing. As a former SIO, I know how dangerous unattended domestic incidents can be. Certainly, they can increase the homicide rate. There's no doubt about that. What I'm interested in is two things. One is follow-up. So if there's a follow-up, and there will be a follow-up required for victims who are dealt with in this way, is that then done by video or is that done in person?
As in the secondary investigation?
Yes.
Yeah. So that would be as it usually would be. So that would be done in person. Okay,
so in relation to the initial video contact, what about disclosure and continuity of evidence there? Is that initial video contact, rapid response, if you like, treated evidentially in as much as a complaint? In which case, is it introduced under CPIA as evidence of first complaint, then followed up and introduced in a Section 11 or a witness statement, yeah?
Yes, very much
exactly
so. So it's stored in a MOPI compliant and CPIA compliant fashion. So we have the video footage retained, very similar to body-worn video. And then we've had discussions with the Crown Prosecution Service, and they actually think it's really positive because, and I've seen videos only this week of victims showing their demeanour, but also their injuries and the state of the scene, and that's able then to be exhibited by the RVR officers as their physical attendants in the same way that body-worn video would be.
Fascinating.
Thank you very much indeed. Just to follow up a little bit on that, all victims are asked when they part of the consent process that the footage will be recorded and it will be possibly used for evidential purposes. So they're aware of it and it can go through to evidence-led prosecutions.
Hi Stacey, hi Kent. Excellent presentation. It's great to see policing trying to move in the 21st century. My question really refers to what external challenges you faced from key stakeholders.
Because initially, I suppose, the challenges we faced was without seeing the presentation and the evidence base, everybody's immediate reaction is that a physical response is better. So the initial reaction without engaging with someone or stakeholder has been that response. As soon as they have seen the data and the evidence base, which is so strong, we're then able to discuss with them how much better it is. So we've spoken to very many DA charities, and they actually, there were times we were looking at different areas of the population that we might not offer the service to, and they said, no, we very much want this service offered to as many and as broad a population as we can. So they're actually very supportive of it, and they know that they're then going to be able to get their referrals much sooner, much quicker, and with victims much more satisfied. With our female victim rate going from satisfaction rate from 78 to 89%, then when they then engage with the victims, they're getting a much more positive response as well. So it's been really good, but the more that we can publicise the work that we do, the better really, because then everybody can see that really strong evidence base that we've made.
Stacey, there's also the IDVA trial thing, right?
Yeah, so we did the concept with the Independent Violence Advisor. They were really supportive. The lady that did the test call really enjoyed the service, as did the victim and the officer. You know, we talked about iterations. Wouldn't it be wonderful if we had a one-stop shop where all our partner agencies were able to dial into the call and a victim got an RVR officer and then all the supportive services thereafter? But I'm dreaming, so that would be the future maybe.
Question about operations. Are these officers like dedicated to doing this full time, or is it possible to have people rotation? Have you thought about, like, if this was me taken elsewhere, do you have to have a special unit, special training, or
a very good question. So we could have modelled it anyway, didn't we? We discussed it in lots of different ways, but for domestic abuse we wanted to make sure that we were giving our vulnerable victims the best officers that we could, that were specially trained in domestic abuse, and we've seen some talks today about how that can really enhance our services. For non-domestic abuse and volume crime, you might then say, actually, do we need a specialist team, and should this be something that our frontline officers learn as a skill to be a virtual response officer to complement the way in which, you know, we have virtual response and physical response. So I think there can be two models that can be considered.
So I was interested in the last question about stakeholders. You've talked about this to chief officers in CPD session, Stacey, and one of the things that I thought you did very well was to bring out how running a trial can actually help with risk in innovation. I wondered if you wanted to say a little bit more about how you did that.
Yeah, so that's quite interesting really. 2 years ago, if we'd have said let's do video response to victims of domestic abuse, we would have all said that wouldn't be possible, and that the operational risk and the risk to victims would have been far too great to consider. To be able to do, and actually it's Ken McFadden that can take a lot of credit for the support and the initial design of this, to be able to offer that as an additional service in a safe and controlled environment where we could really closely monitor what was happening and whether it improved service or not. We didn't know at the time that we did the experiment, and that's why we did the experiment, that it would work. We had discussed that it may well not work in certain ways, it might be good or bad for certain cohorts of victims. So by doing a robust evidence base in the way that we've done, or two in fact, we're then able to withstand scrutiny of those people that really want to protect domestic abuse victims, and rightly so, for us to be able to say, actually, we've really done the groundwork here to make sure that our service is much more improved. And I would say to the chief officers that are sort of watching this, that when you're considering randomised control trials, and like Heather says, they're costly and timely, but when you're looking at doing something that has got operational risk, being able to use that methodology then really gives you the ability to limit that risk and then look to be able to create an evidence base which will then help you implement it should you require it.
Just one question from me, Stacey, please. Just in terms of the satisfaction data, was that taken up to current date, or was that 20 and 21? Because the only thing I'm thinking is the environmental factors and the impact of COVID. People during that period were fearful of their life and meeting people face-to-face generally. And I just wonder whether that would impact on the findings, because I personally in that period would have been pleased to have a video response call, rather than obviously now I might be inclined to go back to, actually I want to see someone face-to-face.
So it's a good question. The first trial, RTREC, there were a period of calls before and after, and actually did a little bit of analysis to see if there was a difference, and there wasn't. So it's a really good question. But RVR, rapid video response, came this last year. So actually I don't think that had as big an effect as it would have done before. But you're exactly right, and actually we see that as an opportunity, a culture change, if you like.
Question in terms of getting the tech sort of built in, and how did you get any pushback, and how difficult was it to get relatively new tech implemented quickly in what I imagine is quite a high risk environment? Because I imagine if I told the Met, can I get our video response quickly, I'd have lots and lots of stakeholders telling me about lots of information security implementation, and it would take a very, very long time.
Essentially we got the second randomised control trial up and running in 3 weeks, which was pretty momentous, really. You're exactly right, Andreas. There are contingencies and concerns that the information security and IT department had, and we were able to, again, because we were using a randomised controlled trial and a controlled environment, we were able to get that expedited. So we worked together with our heads of departments and we got that done within the 3 weeks. And it's thanks to them and their agility that we were able to push that through. But it wasn't an easy task. And even then building it into our infrastructure for implementation, there have been challenges that have presented there as well. But actually our drive to give a first-class service to victims in Kent has meant that support from our chief officer team has enabled that to happen.
And I just want to close this discussion by putting in a word for the planet we live on, because potentially the carbon footprint that police cause, not only through emissions of fuel, but also the tires that appear to be killing our children with nitrous oxide. It's just amazing to consider what range of things we could stop sending police cars to and handle by video in a way that will help to save the planet as well as all of the people who we're dealing with.